She was never a burden, a mother's fight to keep her daughter. My parents cut me off the day I refused to hand over my 8-year-old daughter. My mother told me flatly that the girl was too much trouble. My sister went further, saying everyone's life would be easier if she simply weren't around anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of them. I stood up from the table and walked straight out the front door, and nothing between us was ever the same again. The next time my family saw the two of us together, they could not disguise their surprise. I remember sitting at my parents' kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. A coffee I had poured but never actually drank, trying to force the words out of my mouth before I ended up hurling the mug across the room instead. My ex-husband Brian had just informed me, almost casually, that he intended to move our daughter Cora out of state to live with the woman he'd cheated on me with. I had driven straight to my parents' house afterward, still trembling from the conversation, because some part of me still believed that outrage on my behalf would be automatic, that walking through that door would mean walking into support. "He actually thinks he can just take her," I said, my voice cracking, "like she's luggage he can toss in the trunk." My mother stood near the sink, drying the same plate over and over, not really drying it at all. My father sat at the head of the table, the television murmuring faintly from the next room, his eyes fixed on nothing. My sister Erica leaned against the counter with her arms folded, looking at me the way you'd look at a spill on the floor you didn't want to be the one to clean up. In the next room, Cora sat with her sketchpad and her headphones on, drawing robots with tiny, careful, square hands. I remember every detail of that image because everything that happened afterward seemed to split that night cleanly into a before and an after. I had walked into that kitchen expecting my family to back me up. Instead, I got a verdict. My mother set the plate down at last. She didn't come sit next to me. She didn't ask what exactly Brian had said, whether Cora had overheard any of it, or even whether I'd eaten that day. Instead, she pulled out the chair across from me, folded her dish towel into a small, tidy square, and said, "Alina, calm down," in the exact tone she used to use when I'd overcooked pasta as a teenager. Not the tone you'd expect for a man who skipped therapy sessions and abandoned his family mid-meltdown, suddenly demanding full custody. "I am calm," I told her, even though my voice betrayed me. "I'm telling you he thinks he can take my child from me." Her face barely shifted. "If her father wants her," she said, "then let him have her." The room didn't erupt. That was somehow the worst part of all. My father looked down at his glass and traced the rim with his thumb, saying absolutely nothing. Erica's eyebrows lifted for half a second, but she didn't push back either. The refrigerator hummed. A cabinet door clicked shut somewhere in the kitchen. I kept waiting for anyone, to laugh and admit my mother had lost her mind. Nobody did. My father's silence sat there like a second voice in the room, agreeing without ever having to speak. That was the first crack. I shoved my chair back so hard it screeched against the tile, hard enough that my mother actually flinched. The first sign she understood I had heard her perfectly. "No," I said. "Absolutely not. She is my daughter. I'm not handing her over just because Brian suddenly decided he wants to play father in front of an audience." My mother inhaled sharply through her nose, the sound she always made when she thought I was being deliberately dramatic. My father reached for the remote and muted the television, the first sign, finally, that this conversation had earned his full attention. Erica uncrossed her arms and came to sit beside my mother instead of behind me, and I understood in that instant which side of the table they had already chosen. "You need to think practically," my mother said. "Practically," I repeated, "about my own child." She gave a small shrug, and somehow that tiny motion felt uglier than if she'd shouted. "About your entire life." I could hear, faintly, the scratch of Cora's marker against paper in the next room. She was still close enough to hear every word. I should have lowered my voice right then. I didn't. I was still trying to process how I'd ended up defending my own daughter to my own family, still arguing with people who, I would only later understand, had never really been on my side to begin with. Erica leaned forward, elbows on the table, as if she'd been waiting all evening for permission to be cruel and dress it up as honesty. "She takes so much," she said. "Your time, your money, your energy, your whole life has turned into managing one crisis after another." I turned toward her so fast my neck ached. "She's 8 years old," I said. She needs support, not a performance review. Erica rolled one shoulder, unbothered. I'm not being cruel, I'm being honest. My mother nodded along as if that settled the matter for good. You've put your entire life on hold, she added. For years now. And then my father, who had barely said a word all evening, gave one small, quiet nod of agreement. That nod hurt more than anything Erica had said. If he had raised his voice at me, I could have fought back. If he'd said something blunt and cruel, I could have answered it. But that small, contained gesture told me this had already been discussed, somewhere, without me in the room. Brian has a stable job, Erica went on. Maybe he really can offer her more stability than you can right now. I let out one short, sharp laugh. Brian disappears the moment a checkout scanner beeps too loudly, I said. Nobody argued with that. They simply looked annoyed that I'd made their argument less convenient. That was the moment I understood they meant every single word they'd said. The conversation turned cruel so quickly it felt almost rehearsed. My mother looked past me, toward the hallway, and said, in the same flat tone she'd used to complain about a broken appliance, "She is such a burden." For one full second, I genuinely believed I'd misheard her, because there was no version of reality in which a grandmother said that about her own grandchild. Then Erica added, without lowering her voice at all, honestly, things would be easier for everyone without her around. She said it the way you'd talk about clearing out a cluttered closet. I stood up so fast my chair toppled over behind me. Do not talk about my daughter like that, I said. My mother rose too, not angry, not ashamed, just cold. Then hear me clearly, she said. If you choose to keep her, don't bother calling me your mother. My father stayed exactly where he was. He looked at the fallen chair, then at the table, then down at his own hands. He still said nothing at all. Somewhere in the next room, a pencil rolled off a table and stopped. The whole kitchen seemed to change shape in that instant. It wasn't the house I'd grown up in anymore. It was a room full of people asking me to choose their comfort over my own child. Then the hallway went quiet, and I knew before I even turned around that Cora had heard everything. She stood just outside the kitchen doorway, headphones hanging loose around her neck, one hand gripping her sketchpad so tightly the cardboard had started to bend. Her face wasn't loud or dramatic. That would have almost been easier to face. She simply looked stunned, like the floor beneath her had opened up and she was still waiting to land somewhere solid. Cora, I said, moving toward her, and she backed away before turning and running down the hall to the guest room where we'd been staying. I found her on the floor wedged between the bed and the wall, knees pulled to her chest, trying so hard to stay silent that it hurt just to watch her. Hey, I said softly, dropping down beside her. Baby, look at me. She kept her eyes on the carpet. After a long moment she whispered, Grandma doesn't want me here. I put my hand over hers and felt her shaking beneath my palm. Listen to me, I said. You did nothing wrong, not one single thing. She swallowed hard. Am I the reason everything's bad? No, I said. You are not the problem in this house. She leaned into me then, trembling, and held on tight. That was the moment I stopped trying to argue my case. I didn't go back into that kitchen to negotiate, and I didn't wait around for anyone to knock on the guest room door and try to undo what had already been said. I pulled out 2 overnight bags and packed quickly. Cora's soft pajamas, her headphones, her tablet charger, her stuffed fox, her gray blanket, every sensory tool I could find in the dresser drawers. She sat on the mattress and watched me move around the room with the kind of sharp, focused calm that only shows up once the panic has burned itself out. My mother appeared in the doorway once. Elena, don't be so dramatic, she said. I zipped the bag shut and kept moving. Erica passed behind her in the hallway and muttered, This is exactly what we're talking about. My father stood further back, one hand braced against the wall, watching the whole scene like a man observing weather rolling in from a distance. You had the power to stop this, I told him, without raising my voice at all. And you used it by saying nothing. Then I took Cora's hand, gathered the bags, and walked her out through the house I'd grown up in. No photographs, no goodbyes, no pausing at the door. The porch light clicked on automatically as I opened it. Cora looked up at me and asked, Are we ever coming back? I tightened my grip on her hand and led her to the car without answering. That silence was the moment I chose her, out loud, once and for all. To understand how we ended up in that kitchen, you have to go back further, to the hot Saturday afternoon of Cora's 3rd birthday, held in my parents' backyard. I had spent the entire morning trying to make the party gentle enough for her to actually enjoy it. I trimmed the guest list down, bought quiet toys instead of noisy ones, and asked everyone, more than once, not to crowd her. Relatives came through the gate anyway, bringing noise in with them like it was part of the gift. Balloons popped against the backs of chairs. Someone dragged out a Bluetooth speaker and cranked the volume. My aunt bent down toward Cora with frosting still on her finger just as two cousins started shrieking over a jar of bubbles, and Cora dropped straight to the grass as if her strings had been cut all at once. She screamed, clapped both hands over her ears, and kicked when my uncle tried to scoop her up. "Don't touch her," I said, already on my knees beside her. "Give her space." My mother stood near the patio table holding a stack of paper plates, looking embarrassed rather than concerned. Erica leaned toward another relative and whispered, "What's wrong with her?" Brian, my husband at the time, took one look at the scene and slipped out through the side gate, as if he needed fresh air more urgently than his own daughter needed comfort. I stayed on the grass with Cora until her breathing slowed back to normal. A few weeks later, after a string of appointments and paperwork and a specialist who watched her carefully before saying anything at all, I heard the word autism spoken about my daughter for the first time. The official diagnosis came a little later still, but the emotional distance from my family had already begun at that birthday party, and over the following years, nobody in my family ever really warmed up to who Cora actually was. About a month after her diagnosis, I had an afternoon at the grocery store that felt like a warning shot for everything that would follow in my marriage. Cora was in the cart, already tired, and I was rushing through milk, cereal, and detergent before the afterwork crowd hit. Then the overhead lights in one aisle began to flicker. A baby started crying 2 carts over. The checkout scanner kept firing off the same sharp, piercing beep again and again. Cora pressed both hands over her ears. "Too loud," she said, and then louder. "Too loud, too loud, too loud." I abandoned half the cart right there, lifted her against my hip while she kicked and struggled, and carried her outside while strangers watched me like I'd somehow failed some kind of public test. By the time we made it home, we were both drenched in sweat. I got her settled into her dim bedroom with her weighted blanket, then stood at the kitchen counter trying to steady my own shaking hands. Brian walked in, saw the grocery bag still sitting by the door, and asked, "What happened this time?" I explained. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask if I needed a break. He grabbed his keys instead and said, "I can't keep doing this every single day." "You don't," I told him. He acted like he hadn't heard me. "I've got to go, work's running late." The door shut before I could say anything else. That sentence of his became a pattern. I kept bringing Cora to my parents' house for a while anyway, still clinging to the hope that familiarity might do what warmth clearly wasn't going to. One quiet afternoon there, she sat on the den rug lining up her toy cars by color: blue, then green, then yellow, then back again because she liked that particular sequence better. Erica walked in with an iced coffee, watched for maybe 10 seconds and rolled her eyes. "She doesn't even play like a normal kid," she said. "She's playing," I answered. "She just isn't doing it to entertain you." My mother laughed quietly under her breath, as if I were the one overreacting to nothing. Later that same visit, while Cora stayed absorbed on the floor, my parents stood across the kitchen island discussing Erica's future as though they were flipping through a travel brochure. "When you have kids," my mother told her, "we're going to spoil that grandbaby rotten." My father smiled and said he couldn't wait to teach some future little one how to fish. I stood there holding Cora's juice box, listening to them speak with more warmth about an imaginary, not yet conceived child than they had ever once shown the granddaughter sitting 15 feet away from them. Cora never looked up. I did. That was the moment their quiet neglect became impossible for me to keep excusing. By the time I found the messages on Brian's phone, the affair itself didn't shock me nearly as much as the sudden shift in his energy did. He'd been distant and flat with me for months, and then all at once he was smiling down at his screen, typing with both thumbs, carrying his phone face down whenever he left a room. One night he left it on the bathroom counter while he showered, and a message banner lit up from a woman named Sydney that began, "I missed you already." I opened the thread and only stopped reading once the words started to blur in front of me. It wasn't flirtation. It was an entire relationship, complete with its own routines, private jokes, and future plans. When he stepped out of the shower, towel around his waist, I held the phone up and asked, "How long has this been going on?" He glanced at the screen once and sighed like I'd caught him with an unpaid parking ticket. Does it even matter? He said. Yes, I told him. It matters to me. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his face. This hasn't been working for a long time now. Not sorry, not ashamed, just inconvenienced by my questions. Within days, the separation became real, and because I needed somewhere stable while I sorted out finances, schooling, and therapy schedules, I moved back into my parents' guest room with Cora. I mistakenly believed, at the time, that having a roof over our heads was the same thing as having support. The custody threat itself arrived so casually that it took me a moment to fully register what Brian was even saying. We were sitting across from each other at a chain restaurant, since neither of us wanted to have the conversation inside a house, while Cora was 2 blocks away at an after-school program. Brian stirred an iced tea he had no intention of drinking and told me that Sydney had a job opportunity in another state, and that maybe it made sense for Cora to go with them for what he called a fresh start. I laughed once, short and humorless. No, I said. You don't get to vanish during every hard week and then relocate her like she's a work transfer. His expression shifted instantly. I'm still her father, he said. You don't own her, and honestly, you barely know her, I answered. You skipped her appointments. You left stores when things got difficult. You disappeared the second anything got hard. He leaned back and folded his arms. If you want a fight, he said, I'll give you one. And there it was, not concern, not love, not some sudden urge to be a better parent, just a contest he intended to win. I picked Cora up from her program with his words still echoing in my head and drove straight to my parents' house, needing someone, anyone, to confirm that I wasn't overreacting to real danger. That was how I ended up sitting at their kitchen table expecting backup and instead receiving a verdict. The hotel room we checked into that night smelled like industrial cleaner mixed with stale air conditioning, and Cora knew immediately, the second the door opened, that it wasn't home. She froze in the entryway, backpack still on her shoulders, staring at the carpet, the 2 stiff beds, the yellowish lighting, the humming wall unit, the strip of light glowing under the door. No, she said quietly. No, no, no. I set the bags down and moved into action immediately. Because there wasn't space for me to fall apart too. I switched off the air conditioner, rolled up towels to block the gap beneath the door, and spread her gray blanket over one of the beds. I lined her headphones, stuffed fox, toothbrush, and tablet up neatly on the nightstand and asked, Can you help me build a safe corner? She was breathing too fast to speak, but she nodded anyway. Together, we dragged the desk chair into the corner of the room, draped her blanket over it like a makeshift roof, and sat beneath it with the lamp switched off. When are we going home? She asked, the first of many times she would ask that same question that night. We're going somewhere new, I told her honestly, and I'm going to be with you the whole time. Sometime after midnight, she finally leaned into my shoulder and let herself unclench. Broken as things were, I was still her home. Within 4 days, I found a small rental apartment in an older brick building with a narrow staircase and a landlord who cared far more about the rent check than about anyone's backstory. It had a tiny kitchen, a living room barely large enough for a second-hand couch, and one small bedroom at the end of the hall that I turned into Cora's space before I'd even unpacked my own belongings. I swapped out harsh overhead bulbs for soft lighting, labeled clear storage bins for socks, art supplies, and sensory toys, taped a picture schedule up beside her door, and arranged her favorite blankets in the exact same layered order every time, because structure calmed her faster than any words ever could. When she walked in from school and saw the room fully set up, she ran 2 fingers along the labels and said, You made it make sense. That same night, my mother texted, not to ask where we were, and not to ask if Cora had settled in okay, but to say, Let me know when you're coming to get the rest of your things. We are not a storage unit. I read it twice, turned the phone face down on the counter, and went back to assembling a wobbly thrift store bookshelf. Brian sent 2 aggressive emails about custody that same week, then missed a scheduled call with Cora's therapist and went completely silent after that. My mother's message sat there, unanswered, indefinitely. Some silences explain themselves. That first Christmas came and went with no invitation, no phone call, and no last-minute excuse dressed up as scheduling trouble. By then, Cora was old enough to notice the absence without me having to explain it to her. A week before the holiday, she stood at our apartment window watching the mail truck pass and asked, Are we going to Grandma's this year? I didn't lie to her. No, I said. She thought about that for a moment and then asked, can we just stay home? So we built our own version of the holiday. I picked up matching pajamas from a clearance rack, cut frozen pizza into star shapes with kitchen scissors, and set a tiny artificial tree on the windowsill because floor space was too tight for anything bigger. Cora spent an hour rearranging the string lights by color before she'd let me plug them in. On Christmas morning, I gave her the one gift that mattered most, a beginner robotics kit with snap-together circuits and a booklet full of build projects. She opened it, sat cross-legged on the rug, and disappeared into it for the rest of the day, surfacing only to ask for batteries and a grilled cheese sandwich. I sat and watched her focus settle over the whole apartment. Outside those walls, my family told people I'd cut myself off from them. Inside those walls, I was quietly building a holiday nobody could ever take away from her. By the time Cora turned 14, the apartment looked different, but the rhythm inside it hadn't changed. Clear surfaces, labeled drawers, routines taped exactly where she needed them, and plenty of room for her mind to work the way it worked best. One evening she came home from school carrying a half-finished engineering model from a district showcase project that her teacher's senior students had been building. She set it down on our kitchen table, frowned once, and said, "Their wiring diagram is wrong." I looked over the tangle of colored wires and plastic housing and understood none of it. "Wrong how?" I asked. She pointed to one section. "If the sensor triggers here, the whole system stalls out. They basically built it to fail." She emailed her teacher, Mr. Alvarez, who wrote back within minutes, "Can you show me tomorrow?" Instead of waiting until morning, Cora pulled out graph paper, redrew the entire circuit sequence, and stayed up half the night rebuilding the model piece by piece, while I quietly handed her tape, tea, and silence. The next afternoon, Mr. Alvarez called me directly from the school's workshop. "Your daughter just fixed a problem my senior students missed entirely," he said. "She doesn't think the way everyone else does, and that's exactly her strength." Cora came home that day carrying the repaired project and a shy, stunned expression I wanted to freeze in time forever. My family had spent years measuring everything she found difficult. I had spent those same years watching everything she was capable of building. The scholarship email arrived on an ordinary evening while the sink sat full of dishes and I was chopping onions for soup. Cora, 18 by then and taller than me, sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and 3 college portals bookmarked in a neat row because she liked checking things in the same order every time. Then she went completely still, not excited, still but blank still. She stood up, turned the laptop toward me and said, "Read this." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and leaned in over her shoulder. It was an acceptance letter to an elite engineering and innovation program, full scholarship, housing included, a research grant attached. I read the opening paragraph twice because my eyes kept blurring. "Cora," I said. She gripped the edge of the table. "Is this real?" "It's real." She sat down hard and covered her mouth with both hands. I kept reading the rest out loud anyway, because saying a thing out loud in a room somehow makes it settle into the walls for good. When I reached the line about her exceptional design thinking and her commitment to accessible technology, I laughed and cried at the same time. Cora looked at me over her fingers and said quietly, "They actually want me there." "Of course they do," I said, right there in that little kitchen. After everything we'd been through, someone had finally exactly gotten her right. What began as a university project refused to stay small for very long. Cora had designed a sensory-friendly assistive device that helped neurodivergent kids manage overstimulation without drawing unwanted attention to themselves. One of her professors pulled her aside after a presentation and told her, "Don't let anyone else commercialize this before you fully understand what you've built." She spent the next 2 years refining it, testing it with real families, and learning how to sit across from investors who kept mistaking her quiet manner for uncertainty, right up until she opened a prototype case and made every single one of them pay attention. Then one afternoon, back in that same apartment kitchen where we'd once opened her scholarship email together, her phone rang from an unknown number. She answered, listened, and went completely still. I was wiping down the counter and knew better than to interrupt. When she finally lowered the phone, she looked almost annoyed at how stunned she felt. "They're in," she said. "National rollout. Final paperwork next week." "Who's in?" I asked. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "The The partner, the big one. I sat down because my legs had stopped cooperating. She stood in the middle of our little kitchen, phone still in hand, as years of quiet, unglamorous work suddenly turned into something the entire country was about to see. A month later, an embossed invitation arrived in our mailbox for an industry gala, where Cora would be honored for the very device that had just been picked up for national distribution. The ballroom that night was all glass and gold light and polished floors that made every footstep sound deliberate. Staff tested microphones up on the stage while servers moved between round tables, setting water glasses at exact, careful angles. I stood near the back wall pretending to be fascinated by a floral arrangement, because if I looked toward the stage for too long, I started seeing the hotel room again, the thrift store bookshelf. All those years when Cora's success had been something private we built with no one watching or applauding. Cora, grown now and steady in a dark blue dress she'd chosen specifically because the fabric didn't itch, stood near the front speaking with one of the event organizers. Then the whole room shifted for me. My parents had just walked in. I never did learn who had passed along the event details, but whatever guest list the gala was working from clearly wasn't strict enough to keep them out. Erica walked in beside them, dressed in cream-colored satin and radiating confidence, already scanning the tables for Cora. My mother's expression arranged itself instantly into the kind of warm, practiced smile people rehearse in front of mirrors. My father, who had once sat silently through the worst night of my life without saying a single word, now stood tall beside her like a man fully prepared to accept congratulations on someone else's behalf. None of them looked hesitant walking in. None of them looked like people entering a room they had no right to be in. They looked eager. They had dressed for ownership. I started moving toward them, but they reached Cora first. My mother got there before I could, touching Cora's arm as if she'd personally earned the right to. "Look at you," she said softly. "We always knew you were meant for great things." Erica stepped in beside her, already flashing a bright smile aimed outward toward the nearby guests. "Families should be together for moments like this," she said. My father hovered just behind them both, nodding at strangers as though he expected to be introduced any moment. Cora stood very still, the kind of stillness that could look like composure to anyone who didn't actually know her. I knew better. It meant she was taking inventory. My mother kept going, undeterred, raising her voice slightly. "We're just so proud of her," she announced. "She's overcome so much." Erica laughed lightly and added, "Our girl has always been brilliant." I felt cold all over, not because they were lying in front of a crowd, but because they were doing it with such easy confidence, the entitled certainty of people who genuinely believed that success simply erases history. A reporter with a badge around her neck turned slightly toward them. An event volunteer smiled, clearly assuming she was witnessing some kind of touching family reunion. My mother leaned in as if she might actually kiss Cora's cheek. I stepped between them before she got the chance. They hadn't come to apologize. They'd come to attach themselves to something. "Leave," I said. I didn't raise my voice, and somehow that seemed to irritate my mother far more than shouting would have. "Alina," she said, dropping into a low, confidential tone. "It's been enough time." "Not for this," I answered. Erica crossed her arms and gave me the exact look she used to wear back in my parents' kitchen whenever basic compassion had become inconvenient for her. "You're really still doing this?" she asked. "Tonight of all nights?" I looked her dead in the eye. "Especially tonight." My mother tried once more. "We're family, whether you like it or not." "Family doesn't tell an 8-year-old she'd be better off gone," I said. Her mouth tightened. Erica leaned in closer, lowering her voice just enough to sound strategic rather than desperate. "No one's asking to relive old drama here. Cora's doing well now. You both are. There's room to repair things, to support each other, to reconnect the right way." And there it was, tucked neatly beneath the makeup and the soft language, access. Access to Cora, to her story, to whatever money, prestige, or reflected light might spill off her success. My father shifted his weight and looked at everything in the room except me. For one second, I thought I might have to keep fighting for that microphone-less center of the room entirely on my own. Then Cora turned to face them fully. The room was about to hear her, whether they were ready or not. She didn't step back behind me, and she didn't move toward them either. She simply turned to face them squarely, shoulders straight, hands loose at her sides, and spoke in the exact same calm, level voice she used whenever she was explaining a design flaw nobody else had caught. "I remember more than you think," she said. My mother opened her mouth, but Cora kept talking right over her. "Not every word. I was 8, but I remember enough." The people standing nearby stopped pretending not to listen. I watched the reporter freeze with her pen halfway to her notebook. The event organizer's practiced smile dropped completely as her eyes moved between Cora and me. "I remember the shouting," Cora continued. "I remember standing in the hallway. I remember Grandma saying I was a burden. I remember Aunt Erica saying everyone would be better off without me." Erica let out a thin, forced laugh. "Cora, honey, that's not..." Cora cut her off without raising her volume at all. "You don't get to stand here and act proud of me now." Then she turned to look directly at my mother and delivered the sentence that finally cracked the whole room open. "When I was 8 years old, you wanted my mother to give me up. You called me a burden." The silence that followed was total. Nobody in that ballroom needed footnotes or context. The truth had simply arrived, whole and undeniable. My mother reached for denial the way some people reach for a coat the second the weather turns. "That's not what happened," she said, too quickly. Erica let out a brittle little laugh and glanced around, searching for agreement that never came. "This is such an exaggeration," she said. My father did what he had always done whenever the truth threatened to cost him something. He stood there, and he said absolutely nothing. Cora watched all three of them with a steadiness that still humbles me every time I think back on it. Then she said, "You stopped being my family the night my mother chose me, and you chose your own comfort instead." Nobody interrupted her that time. She turned away from them, reached for my hand, and held on tight. That one small gesture accomplished something that years of arguing never had. It ended the conversation entirely, without asking anyone's permission. Around us, the crowd instinctively drew back from my parents and Erica, the way people always do once a performance collapses, and the machinery underneath is finally exposed for what it is. My mother's face finally lost its rehearsed softness for good. Erica cycled through fury, then embarrassment, then something small and shrinking. My father stared down at the floor. No security guard came to remove them. No host swept in to rescue the moment. They simply found themselves standing, fully exposed, in the exact truth they had spent years working to avoid, with no audience left willing to pretend otherwise. For once, the silence in that room belonged entirely to them. In the weeks that followed the gala, the story spread through the wider family faster than any piece of news ever had before. Relatives who had stayed carefully, politely neutral back when I first left my parents' house started reaching out again, and once they learned exactly what had been said to an 8-year-old Cora all those years ago, some of them quietly distanced themselves from my parents and Erica without any dramatic announcement at all. A cousin stopped inviting them to host family gatherings. An aunt who'd once tried to stay diplomatically on both sides suddenly found her clarity. My parents hated losing that social standing, but that particular loss was never the one that mattered most to me. The real consequence, the one that actually mattered, was much simpler. Cora didn't want any contact with them. Not a private apology, not a reconciliation lunch, not a fresh start built on a softened, edited version of events. "I'm done," she told me one ordinary morning as we ate eggs together in her own kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter, prototype parts arranged neatly in trays along the wall. "They don't get to show up now, just because there's finally something to brag about." I nodded and passed her the hot sauce. "Then they don't," I said. She went on to receive her award, kept building her company, and built a life full of work she genuinely loved, real peace and friends who never once treated her like a burden. So I'll leave it to you. Did Cora do the right thing by cutting off contact for good, or would you have given them one more chance? Let me know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe.